I didn't know how long this was going to take to fill, and so I did throw us in. We get the 109 in the Puppy Superflex. The pick I really wanted there comes off the board at 107, CeeDee Lamb. What are you seeing? Who do you like?
Did you like that because you could potentially take Dak Prescott on the way back, or you just wanted to take Lamb?
I like CeeDee Lamb here. One of the things that we want to emphasize is that this is a much more running back heavy version of the contest. But Ben, it does seem like CJ Stroud is pretty interesting here. Are you seeing anybody else?
Yeah, no. The only concern before you click draft is, he clicked draft. he has a week 14 bye, and Jayden Daniels is a really fun second round quarterback. And also, I've drafted Bo Nixon a lot of these. So we are going to do a puppy but super flex draft here. It's fun. It's fun to think through how you want to play quarterback because some of the values are pretty silly. I ended up building a 5 quarterback team in one of my teams. I wasn't setting out to do that at all. But and some people were saying we're like, I got it, and we're not even questioning it, but I got into a fun little Twitter discussion where somebody was trying to understand the thinking and basically was saying like, well, it's a high floor position. Are you concerned about that at all? Why would you draft so many of them? And the argument would be that there is still variance even among the high floor, and there are still a lot of quarterback injuries. Benchings are a risk. It's not a guarantee that all your quarterbacks stay healthy. I think if you can, you'd love to have 4 starting QBs in a super flex format at good prices. And we are back up here, Sean. We took Stroud. A lot of quarterbacks have gone off in this one. Jefferson just went 1 pick before us. Amon-Ra and Bijan Robinson are there. I made the case recently on Stone Bananas about Bijan Robinson's, legendary upside. We could go down to Jayden Daniels if you want to take another quarterback, and we'd just be stacking that by.
I think based on what you're saying there about Bijan Robinson, that he is the pretty clear choice. I think that Breece Hall is also a very nice pick here. The problem with both of those guys is that they have the week 12 bye, which starts to get things a little bit jammed up. One of the things I've mentioned on some recent shows is that when everything else is equal, and it's usually not, I think you want to lean into some of those very early buys and free up some pathways later on. That's also, as you mentioned, the case with CJ Stroud. One of the things that, may not end up being a huge deal because at the wide receiver position, in not necessarily in this format, but in other formats, you're going to have so many receivers that the buys are going to be more manageable or easier to navigate. But I mean, the Houston and their week 17 matchup, Baltimore, have the same bye. And so if you're trying to load up on both teams, you end up with a ton of week 14 buys, which, there is the potential for that to cause you some trouble as the tournament moves along.
And as we talk about this tournament more, because I had a blast with it. I was just out of town and was able to draft some of these, and then entered, I think, like 20 slow drafts of the Superflex tournament. It's not going to be around for long. These Underdog tournaments do tend to close up pretty quick. But one of my favorite parts of it is when you take a lot, you tend to take your important quarterbacks early. And so as far as correlating, as you were just talking about, this is going to be tricky with Houston and Baltimore, but you know what you're looking for. And it makes it easier, I think, when you start with a quarterback in this format to then build a really smartly correlated team. You don't have to try to backfill and then lose, get sniped on your quarterback late. You start out with, as if you start out quarterback, which I've done in a lot of these as well, you're like, all right, I know the 2 teams that I have to get pass catchers for and the teams that they're playing against, and the good players on those teams are going to be available. So Nico Collins, we're heading back in the 3rd round, still on the board. Stephon Diggs still on the board. Tank Dell will come off the board a little bit later. There are other ways to play Houston, maybe Dalton Schultz or whatever down the line. Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews are going to come off further down the line than they typically do in this format. We have not taken another quarterback. So, I mean, the Bijan Robinson pick is, can still be correlated, but isn't, a huge one to emphasize. But there are a lot of different directions you can go. And the prices, because of all the quarterbacks coming off the board, the prices are a lot more palatable. So fun to think through We're approaching our pick again here. You have Nico at the top of the queue, Sean. Would you consider, because he's the fourth receiver, he might come back around? I'm kind of considering whether we should be trying to hit QB here. And what's been a QB heavy room, Jared Goff and Herbert just went. Now we're all the way down to Kirk Cousins. Maybe that's not. We do have Bijan.
Yeah, I think that we'll get some opportunities. As you mentioned, this has been a QB heavy room. It's a little bit more if we're wanting to get maybe two of the receivers here, but I could probably go with Collins and then with Achane.
Okay. So the other note on in this format, and Sean mentioned to me, and you're typically more willing to do the lighter QB builds in these formats, and you mentioned to me, I mean, we don't have to play a quarterback in the Superflex. We have CJ Stroud now. We're not going to be completely screwed in any kind of a way. This is the heaviest quarterback room that I've seen so far in the few of the drafts that I've done. And I think that's the way that you want to play it in these types of rooms, certainly. But in the rooms that I've got some really good values, I've liked to think about it like I'm playing two quarterbacks and I want to have four, or I mentioned I got to 5 in one, purely because you're still going to get some spike week potential across the quarterback position, and you're maximizing scoring, and there's a contingency element to it as well. Having said that, the other key note here where I was trying to go with that is that there are only 2 starting wide receiver spots in this format. So there's 2 running back spots, 2 wide receiver, 1 tight end, 1 like regular flex. So you can play 3 receivers, certainly. And then the super flex, you can play up to 4 receivers. You can also play up to 4 running backs as a result. You're not required to start 1 more receiver than a running back. It's part of why we went Bijan where we did. Jaylen Waddle. So Achane did go. You have Waddle at the top of the queue. You're kind of thinking about setting up maybe a Miami and potentially even a Cleveland thing, as we were talking through, like in some of the Cleveland stuff?
Yeah, potentially that. And the Miami and Houston face off in week 15. So again, It's a very minor element, but if you like Jaylen Waddle as being undervalued there anyway, which I think you can make a very strong case for, then drafting him at ADP, and ADP could still shift a little bit. The draft I did earlier today was a lot of fun because unlike in BBM, for example, where the ADP values you get are going to be pretty minimal, and that one I was able to take people 7-10 spots away pretty frequently. But I think setting up that elite wide receiver element, getting a couple guys there who, again, then with Waddle, you have that early buy that frees us up, since we do have, so much of the week 14 potential element. But as you mentioned, Cleveland and then San Francisco with George Kittle is someone who could end up being somewhat interesting there. We are seeing this again as a room that is selling the receiver position. So that's something that we'll have to track as we move through.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fascinating because even in this format where you only start 2 receivers, you still have a wide receiver cliff that we talked through earlier on this long episode. If you're listening to one of our shorts episodes, it's one of the recent shorts. You still need elite talent at wide receiver. There's no upside late, right? And so my thought is, like, you don't need to get as deep. You don't need to have as much of a contingency plan built into the way that you're structuring your early rounds. You don't need to get 5 wide receivers deep through 7 or anything like that. But I still want high-end wide receiver talent in those spots where I can get it, and I still can backfill some of the running back stuff. So I love zero RB in this format, actually. We took Bijan here. I think it's the perfect format for a zero RB, where you can still get 2 early tight ends and just be done at tight end and use the extra roster spots for some maybe additional quarterback depth. You don't have to get as deep at receiver either, but you should hit elite wide receivers, potentially elite tight ends, obviously elite quarterbacks, because running back is still the position where you can score late. Having said that, we took Bijan Robinson strictly on the scenario that, like, he's the RB1, he's the legendary, ceiling play, and you can be flexing running backs. And if we're not able to fill the super flex at quarterback, you said to me prior to the show as we talked through this concept, you can play up to 4 running backs as well in a half PPR. There is a case for like prioritizing the running back ceiling plays when you can. Shawn, we're back up almost. Quarterbacks flying off the board in this one. Baker Mayfield just went in the 5th round. Aaron Rodgers is still there. Not really a great fit. We have Trey McBride as an option to go at tight end. We have Zay Flowers and Tank Dell just behind him. Those are the 3 that stand out to me, although Cooper Kupp is still on the board. Any strong leans for you?
Well, this is probably a Flowers pick for me, even though both Flowers and Dell, can create a little bit of additional traffic there at the wide receiver position.
Let's do it. Let's grab Flowers as a bring back on the Stroud Collins week 17 thing. I got to get a better knowledge of the week 15 and 16 matchups. You mentioned that Houston Miami week 15 game right off the top. That's a hole in my in my drafting right now where I'm just focused on the week 17 matchups. I it's not that I think they're the most important, but I just haven't taken the time to learn all of the other playoff matchups. I think that's an important thing to be considering and be targeting in drafts right now, because I think there's a lot of people that aren't thinking through that stuff, frankly, not just myself. Shawn, 4 straight receivers after we go off. Kupp goes. Michael Pittman was there. He goes. Tank Dell, T. Higgins. We don't have the Dell play. Trey McBride does go. So the other option is Mark Andrews to start to build out tight end, or Aaron Rodgers. You're looking at Geno Smith. You don't want to take Rodgers because, we don't have Garrett Wilson or Breece Hall. That's fair. I think we should go Andrews. Do you want to go Geno? Let's go Geno. No, let's go Geno because we can play JSN. Neither of us really loves Mark Andrews. I think structurally the tight end would have been interesting there. But although structurally in a really QB heavy room, the QB is probably the more pressing concern. We could theoretically play a late round tight end position. You can't really play late round quarterback. This is a fascinating room. And because we spend so much time on the other topics, we didn't spend a ton of time talking through how to approach this format. Do you want to talk at all a little bit about the I know you're focused on navigating the draft as well, but about your overall approach, especially to QB in this Superflex format?
Well, there are going to be some key differences, right? But one of the things I do love is that this format does then become actually very, very similar to the FFPC Superflex format, which Colin and I have had a lot of success in part because the FFPC Roster Construction Explorer gives you some huge insights. And one of them is that early QB and then waiting on your QB2 has turned out massive results over the last couple of seasons. And one of the things I was looking at earlier today, because you had mentioned how you're doing all of these very loaded QB rooms, is whether or not you want to be really quarterback heavy in those instances. And at least in the FFPC, which again is going to be slightly different in that the QB scoring is mitigated, and with full PPR, you're going to have other positions that more easily hit into that Superflex spot. But one of the things that was interesting is that 4QB and 5QB had similarly high win rates and even higher levels of the really high-end outcomes. And so from that perspective, I'll be interested to track as we go through here what QBs are actually available, if we like how they fit into the roster. One of the reasons why I don't necessarily like to push the QB in this specific format is that, especially for this, I really like Daniel Jones, and I also then like Bo Nix. And so for both of those guys, you can get them late, and I think they're such fantastic selections, in part because now that this is a 20-round draft too. So you get 2 additional rounds. That part is very fun. In the previous draft that I did, Jalen Hyatt was not even selected, and his ADP is super low. Right. And if you do a search for him, you find images of him making a sensational one-handed catch at.
We are back up, so you'll have to talk more about the Jalen Hyatt propaganda in a
Right,
moment.
right.
We're on this screen. I can't see the queue
Okay,
as we have about 15 seconds.
Yeah,
I mean, I would
it's
probably
your tight
go.
ends here.
Yeah, I would probably go Pitts here. Don't you think? Or do you have something else you're seeing? Okay. So Kyle Pitts comes all the way back to us. We bypass Mark Andrews at the last turn, potentially not allowing ourselves to get into the elite tight end discussion. And Pitts comes all the way back in the later 7th round. Obviously, it's a different format. But to give the audio listeners some context, we are in the range where Calvin Ridley is the highest receiver by ADP. Now, Xavier Worthy is going behind him in this format, and you have started Worthy. I would typically take Worthy before I would take Pitts. I think that's a smart consideration here. Kittle goes off. He would have been a way to maybe get to a second tight end. Yeah, Xavier Worthy is a really good play. There's not really any quarterbacks. Drake May and JJ McCarthy have gone. Daniel Jones goes there, Sean, at 803.
Yeah, it's getting pricey for the QBs here.
It's aggressive for the QBs, absolutely. So we take Xavier Worthy and continue to add a lot of high-end wide receiver production. We only have 2 starting slots and 1 flex, but you need more than just 3 receivers on your team, obviously, to get good prices on players that can be potential breakout stars. Gives you the ability to fill those slots and potentially help at Superflex, because we're looking like we're going to have only 2 starters, and one of them is Geno Smith, who we're talking about upside scenarios for, but we don't even know if he's going to start.
Well, one of the reasons that I had swapped that one from Andrews to Smith is that we just did a big portion of the show on it. It fit too well. There was too much synergy to pass on Geno Smith there.
But so we take Xavier Worthy there. I was going to suggest maybe even in this room, I mean, it's aggressive, but taking Bo Nix, in part because we have Geno, and I think we have to, again, synergy. We have to take probably one of JSN or Lockett and get him stacked up, don't you think? Ideally JSN, but that's going to get us. I don't mind where we're at receiver, but I do feel a little bit of pressure to take a QB. Hopefully Nix just comes back, and we can also get JSN in addition to that.
Yeah, I think that you can. I mean, Geno is one where for him to hit in the final week, you probably need it to be stacked up. And obviously, the more that you have there, the more pathways you have. If CJ Stroud has a big season, but a poor week 17, and then it's the Geno blow up, you would have obviously wanted to have a receiver with him there. I was going to say that you can play him a little bit through Green Bay and Minnesota, but again, for the week 17 element, it probably is mostly JSN, who is a target for us. So that part is pretty easy. It's a question of how do we play, if they both come back to us, how do we play JSN versus Nix?
The guys on the turn went really QB heavy there. What do they have in their builds? So the drafter in the 10 hole has 3 quarterbacks, 3 receivers. The 11 hole has 3 quarterbacks. The 12 hole has 3 quarterbacks.
Bo Nix does go.
Nix comes off the board in the 9th. Well, I think that makes it extremely straightforward that JSN is the preferred pick. He goes 1 pick ahead of us. Not ideal. I do think we should push QB around. You're kind of hovering over Brock Bowers' name. You can go click that other tight end if you want to and get Bowers on the team. I think that makes perfect sense. Little ahead of ADP, but gets us structurally in a place where we can use additional roster spot. I think we can just stop at 2 tight ends with Kyle Pitts and Brock Bowers. And then it's a 20-round draft. And so if you're doing a 2 tight end build, which is perfectly viable if you have this type of tight end depth, and you don't need as much depth at receiver necessarily either, especially with 4 really strong options already locked in. There are ways that you can add some quarterback flexibility late. You don't want a bunch of dead roster spots and guys that aren't actually starting, but guys that have cases to playing a decent amount. You're kind of treating it like a 0 RB build where like you're starting to grab handcuffs and say that, okay, well, if this guy gets a starting job, he's going to have a lot of ceiling and bring us some spike weeks. The best example of that is Justin Fields, because you know that when he's playing, he has massive ceiling. You have put him in the top of the queue. We have Xavier Worthy as well, who is a bring back on his week 17 game. Fields rushing can cause a game to shoot out. I don't know that we necessarily even have to stack him. I think as we get back on the clock here, Sean, he's my preferred pick. What do you think?
Yeah, the other way to go would be DeAndre Swift with the week 17 on Geno.
Let's go Fields. I do really like Swift. I actually just checked my exposures for my first group of finished drafts, and I was clicking him a decent amount because of where he goes in the normal drafts outside of the tight end, the elite tight end window. It's before, like if you miss those guys, it's like he's been going around pick 80. He's still going like 20 picks before Bowers. He's still going like 20 picks before some of the other running backs that I would probably take over him in a vacuum, like Javonte Williams, who I think I would take over Swift. But Swift is just in this pocket where it's like, I think he's a really good pick because you can get those other guys later. As soon as JSN's off the board and Rashee Rice is the other receiver that kind of needs to be off the board. But I often would take DeAndre Swift in that spot. And then I checked my exposures and realized that I was a little bit high on DeAndre Swift. So that's part of why I just pushed us towards Fields. I haven't been doing the Fields thing as much. I've done it a couple times. I know you like to tack him on. I think he's another one like Daniel Jones. It makes a lot of sense in this format because it, like with the extra roster spots, with the extra QB build, you don't need the guy to play all 17 games the way you do in a normal draft, or it's helpful, much more helpful in that format. Even it's sort of counterintuitive because you do have 2 QB spots here, but you're going to draft more of them, and you can have more of a, it's the Frankenstein running back point I was making last year again with the 0 RB analogy, more of a mixed approach to how you're going to get those points and fill those slots because you're going to have a bigger QB build overall. Sean, here in this draft, DeAndre Swift and Javonte Williams just went back-to-back at the turn. And I think Javonte Williams' ADP has been rising a little bit, has it not?
Well, it should be, I think, because
it should be.
Even though in theory it won't affect him, the knee scope for Aldrick Estime, I think more or less completely takes him out of the discussion of, maybe not takes him out of the discussion, but it makes it harder for him to be so impressive this offseason that he takes a lot of early touches. And the thing for Javonte Williams, you're hoping, is that he just gets a chance to play in this offense that should be better, and with Bo Nix being such a good fit for him, and that he's able to demonstrate that he's a completely different guy this year. And if he can't do it, he can't do it. But you'd at least like to see him get that month to like make the case for himself as still being a star.
Sean, this draft has been really fun. This extreme quarterback run that we've talked about, and just like how we've had to approach it and handle it. This is one of the reasons Superflex can be so fun. It's one of the reasons I got so excited about this tournament. I've jumped into it a bunch. I should be trying to jump into some of the FFPC, but obviously for my location, not quite as easy, but we are back up. So I'm going to save that point. You have Tyler Lockett top of the queue. I'm very comfortable with adding another stack piece, a guy that we both talked about really liking. That makes sense. We grab him. As far as the bring back on Swift, by the way, I think both Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson are too cheap. They go in a range where there's not a lot of running backs left. And I think it's because people don't want to pick between them. But DeAndre Swift, as much as I do like the pick, not the picture of health, those are guys that we could potentially grab very, very late. But I was going to say, what's fun about Superflex is every draft can get prioritized differently when all the positions matter in all rounds. And quarterback is so elevated and adds this scarcity element. Because, I mean, in a normal draft, there's always people just pushing quarterback, which is fine. But in Superflex, you get more runs and you get more. If you're a fan of structural drafting and trying to like win your draft room, which I think is fun. It's one of the fun things about this, like coming out of it, like I played this the right way. Every Superflex draft will be more unique, or overall, the Superflex drafts will be more unique, and every Superflex draft is going to be different from the average Superflex draft by a larger margin than other styles of drafting. So it's a fun thing. Recommend it.
I love it. The interesting thing that has happened here is that we lose. Well, we get a little bit of a wide receiver run at the top there, wiping out some of the guys we didn't want. We had talked about Adonai Mitchell just a little bit. I have the quarterbacks in there so we don't forget about him. Chase Brown has the same.
Yeah, Chase Brown.
He has the same buy. You still like that?
Yeah, I'm okay with it. It's not ideal, but this isn't like an eliminator contest. It would make our Week 12 scoring potentially a much weaker. But Chase Brown fits with. We didn't draft a Denver player. I thought we drafted a Denver player. Anyway, Chase Brown's still a good pick, regardless.
Chase Brown undervalued by about 50 picks. Sometimes you have to just throw away the buy when someone is that undervalued.
Yeah, I mean the rest of the running backs were, I think, a pretty clear another tier. Although, well, there's two down there that I'm hoping come back because they go so much lower. Again, I mean, you have to consider ADP. The two further down you had in the queue that I would have been fine going to if their price had risen, but it hasn't yet. I think it will eventually, are Marshawn Lloyd and Kendre Miller, who you have in the queue. Man, the Kendre Miller thing, Sean. I got into his game log a little bit on one of my recent YouTube streams. He's a 21-year-old day 2 rookie who got banged up a lot, didn't get to play a lot. And then plays in week 18 and averages 5.6 yards a carry on his 13 carries, runs for 73 yards. He caught passes when he did play. He had a nice diving catch, that one big play early in the year. But he just didn't get a lot of snaps in overall. He only played 3 games with more than 20 snaps. He only played 4 with more than 10 snaps. Never played more than 30 snaps in a game. Obviously, that's not good, but it was mostly health-related, and he was a 21-year-old rookie. He's still 21. Turns 22 in about a week as of this recording. Very young guy who has a fun profile out of TCU. And then the other side of it is Alvin Kamara looked his age last year. He averaged 3.9 yards per carry. Wasn't very good in the passing game in terms of efficiency. Jamal Williams averaged 2.9 yards per carry. I mean, he's not even that old yet. He's about as old as Kamara, but he looked his age too. And they didn't add anyone else. That's who they have. Kendre Miller's just going to start from week 1, right? Like, he's just going to win this job by the end of August.
I like him. I mean, he's one of 2 guys that I'm going to write about as being potentially this year's Kyron Williams. He's another week 12 bye, but we could make the case that he's such a good value here. I mean, it's really him or Nick Chubb.
And Marshawn Lloyd went. Yeah, we're just going to let the clock run out because I don't want to take Nick Chubb over him after just saying all of that. Yeah, we have 3 week 12 buys at running back. It becomes a problem at a certain point, right? But we're not there yet. That's when I was saying, is he going to start week 1? That's obviously who I was thinking of, Sean, was Kyron Williams. So I love that. I'm excited to read that piece. That player that no one really expects to play as much as they do right away. Like the Saints' plans, the fact that they didn't bring anyone in might just be they have a new offensive coordinator. They're going a different direction. Their plans might just be that Kendre Miller's their guy. Like the Rams' plans ultimately kind of proved to be with Kyron Williams. And I mean, there's just no way of any. I think he's the most mispriced guy of anyone. Like you just mentioned Chase Brown's price. I think it's got to be Miller even more mispriced if you're ranking them. Just from the perspective that if there's any, I mean, the Bengals at least went out and paid Zach Moss some money, but there's just any possibility that Kendre Miller is just the guy they're planning on basically using a ton. I mean, maybe that's an exaggeration of the situation, but the fact that they didn't really bring anyone else in and that Jamal Williams was so bad last year, it really is just how much do they want to continue to use Alvin Kamara? Jamal Williams, by the way, it's all dead money. They get no cap savings from cutting him or anything. They signed him coming off the big touchdown year last year. And we're locked into him into 2024. Sean, you just grabbed Jaylen right there. He was the other guy at the top, and it helps address the week 12 bye issue and pairs with our Jaylen Waddle play, your big week 15 stack with Houston that you mentioned earlier. So that is a really nice pick, as well as we move beyond the Kendre Miller tier. He's sort of the obvious next best running back.
How have you been looking at him? Here's a player who is pretty clearly the running back 3. There are questions about his instincts, his ability to thrive when the offense isn't opening massive holes like they did at Tennessee. And yet, I mean, he's probably the best athlete in this draft at running back. And he's going to the one team that's going to open the same kinds of holes.
Yeah, that piece you mentioned at the top of the show, the perfect storm candidates for Monster 2024 seasons. I just talked through some scenarios that are like really exciting spots to make sure you're exposed to at the very end. One of them I mentioned was the Chicago Bears running backs that I do think are just all over or underpriced. But I also mentioned Miami's running backs. And I wrote that pretty quick because I was kind of running out of time and I needed to get this piece out. But I just wrote, Raheem Mostert led the NFL in touchdowns with 21 last year and is going in the 8th round. Either he's super undervalued or there are a lot of running back tight ends touchdowns available. Devon Achane had a 4-touchdown game and finished with 11 of his own alongside a guy leading the NFL in touchdowns. Again, if it ain't Mostert, Achane may break fantasy football. Rookie Jalen Wright is a third stringer and still might be the most valuable handcuff in fantasy football. That's my Cliff's notes on. I mean, those two backs scored 32 touchdowns last year, and they don't. Where Raheem Mostert's going suggests that nobody thinks he's going to back up the 21 again. If he doesn't back up the 21 again, Achane could go absolutely nuts. But if Mostert misses time, then Jalen Wright is in line to potentially score. I'm not saying they're going to certainly score 32 more touchdowns for their running backs again this year, but this is an offense that gets the ball to the players that they want to get the ball to, and they do it effectively. We're back up, Sean. You have Vidal at the top of the queue right now. I am heavily exposed to him. You also have starred Bucky Irving. He's my highest drafted player when I was just checking my recent exposures. These late rookie running backs, I wrote a piece a little while ago as well that was titled Hammer the Rookie Running Backs in All Formats. I'm certainly doing that. These are some of my highest owned drafted players. We take Vidal there, gets us to 5 running backs. We have the 5 really kind of high-end receivers. And I think in this format, you can, I'd probably throw on some stack additions, but you can kind of stop at 6. We could probably stop at 2 tight ends. The secondary QBs have continued to fly off. So you've started some that are maybe worth adding. The one you have at the top of the queue right now is Jacoby Brissett. They've actually already named him the starter. The buzz out of New England is worrying me for Drake May for year one. They keep talking about how young he is, how low his floor potentially is, and also that they know that they don't have the infrastructure around him for a young QB to succeed. Oh, Brissett goes one pick ahead of us, so that is not going to be the pick. What do you like here?
Well, some of those guys who went will be my preference, but I do think this is the spot to throw Wan'Dale in.
Yep. I was going to say receiver. I didn't like those quarterbacks at the top. The quarterbacks at the top at this point were Michael Penix, Sam Howell, and Joe Flacco, or at least at the top of our queue that you've starred. We have Geno, so I don't know that we necessarily want to go Howell. Do you want to double dip that? I mean, I guess we could.
Well, I think in round 20, if you don't have other options, and in round 20, you can be staring at guys who are more or less zeros, then I think kind of balancing that out and just having yourself covered makes some sense. I think that we can stop at the 3 QBs here if the draft doesn't kind of force us or give us the third. So I mostly just have those guys up there to make sure that we don't forget that they're part of this whole thing. But they're definitely not necessarily priorities. One of the reasons I didn't push the Denver receivers is that they don't fit and they have that week 14 bye. And so in many drafts, obviously, we're looking at Franklin and Mims. They're not as good of fits for this one. A player I wanted to ask you about, because he's the other one I thought would be a good potential pick for us in round 15, where he took Vital, was Roman Wilson. I'm more or less playing this Justin Fields play as completely divorced from anything to do with the Steelers. And I don't have a share of Roman Wilson, but he was going to be a tad bit of a faller and maybe an interesting play in the specific draft where he hadn't otherwise or wouldn't otherwise be. Is he someone in this context that you would have had any openness to?
Yeah. I'm not like into the profile, and I more or less despise Arthur Smith. So I think, if you're playing Fields, you're kind of needing to divorce it because you are assuming that they're doing. One of the things that Arthur Smith offenses did do was run a decent. He called a lot of design runs for Marcus Mariota. And so maybe it's just Justin Fields rushing, really, that is the way that he's scoring. But I've taken Roman Wilson, I believe, twice after ADP, in part because I'm taking so many KC receivers, and you get that week 17 correlation. We did have an option also here to consider Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson. I mentioned liking them. I didn't notice them in the queue. Were you just out on them? I mean, we got
Herbert had just gone right before, and then I didn't get Johnson in there. He would have been a possibility. So that's sort of an oversight. But yeah, I do like him there. I think that, the part that gives me a little concern is that if something happens to Swift, you still then have a secondary problem of the other back is probably good. And yet at the price, it still is an interesting bet.
Right. That's a great way of putting it. It is tricky. It is still a secondary problem. And yet I think the price is right. Now, what I would have said here is I don't take them over Vidal or Bucky Irving, and Tyrone Tracy also went after our Wan'Dale Robinson pick, and I typically take Tracy before them too. Once those guys go off, those Chicago backs become interesting in a normal draft. We're back up here, Sean, and I can't see the queue at the current view.
Oh, you want to know who's available to us?
Yeah, I like that. You got Devontae Walker at the top of the queue. This is where, I make the case for Demarcus Robinson that you're not going to listen to. So we could just go with Devontae Walker.
So I put Demarcus Robinson into the queue for you there. But
one spot behind Jatavian Sanders.
There you go. There you go. Right.
No, we don't need to draft him. I do think he's going to play a lot. And I read an Athletic article yesterday where Jordan Rodriguez, our favorite Rams beat reporter, said that it looks like he's aging in reverse, Sean.
Ooh.
And the late season connection is there. It was there with Stafford.
Because he was not a good player for the Kansas City Chiefs.
He wasn't, but he was pretty good with the Ravens, and he was pretty good last year, and they like his run blocking. That's why they benched Tutu and started playing him. He's going to play a lot in a heavy 11 personnel team. And defenses are not going to care about Demarcus Robinson when Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua are running routes. Had a stretch of 5 straight games with 12-plus half PPR points. Never a ceiling, and it was largely because he caught touchdowns in 4 of those 5 games. But those are usable weeks.
Yeah, he's going to score some more touchdowns. So we have 3 picks remaining. We are currently at 3 quarterbacks, 5 running backs, 7 wide receivers, 2 tight ends.
I do think running back is still Braylon Allen has gotten a little bit of buzz. Sean is
I put in the queue and then took back out because he's another week 12.
Week 12 bye. Is Keaton Mitchell interesting to you as a late season play? He's probably back by week 12.
Yeah, he probably is. But reading about it some more, when a team already is saying this guy is not going to be ready for the start of the season, then I'm starting to think
we got 10 seconds.
What do you play?
What do you
I like Shipley here. Do you? But I'm also, I like Shipley here.
All right. Well, we can take Shipley. I haven't drafted him yet. I'm completely out on Shipley after the landing spot. We were talking about the tush push earlier. It's so hard to envision. And then it's another one. It's like the Bears situation where even if Barkley does miss time, they probably still play some Kenny Gainwell. Like
he was so bad last year.
I know.
Why would you draft Will Shipley if you're going to play Kenny Gainwell? I offer that almost as a rhetorical because we know they're going to play Kenny Gainwell, but it wouldn't make sense.
It wouldn't, but they will. Demarcus Robinson goes off to the board to a highly intelligent drafter. As we continue to barrel towards our final couple picks here. The Mitchell thing is interesting, though, Sean, because I did go back and look earlier this offseason at the reports after his knee tear. And, there was just some really positive stuff then. John Harbaugh was saying it was a clean tear, good surgery when they got in there. It worked well. The fact that they're, setting expectations low for him to play early in the season, I guess I'm not reading it the same way. I guess I feel like they're just look, we want, they're an analytics heavy organization as well. And they want to be look, we're not going to push him because we know the deal that people need the full return. Now, maybe it's an indication that he's not fully healthy. Maybe that's really the case. But I've been playing it as I think that makes sense. That's kind of what I prefer. And it's actually nice if he does come back. Let's say hypothetically he comes back week 8 or week 10. You're playing him when you draft him this late as a handcuff option anyway, really. Maybe he has some standalone value, but more or less it's if Derrick Henry misses time, late season upside. Well, if he's not out there with the potential to get re-injured in any kind of way in the early part of the season, that's not really a bad thing. You're just waiting for sort of there to be some chaos like there is in some backfields in this backfield. And then he comes back healthy and plays, which is basically what he did last year because he was missing the early part of the year. And then there was some chaos. And then eventually when he came back, he played a good amount for a real brief stretch, then got hurt again. Maybe he'll just never have the ability to hold up to an NFL workload. That's another concern. But he does fit this build as well. So I'm still kind of making that case. Rasheen Ali just went ahead of him. That's a pick I can't get behind. I think you go Justice Hill if you don't believe in Keaton Mitchell. But it does fit the Stroud stuff. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on Mitchell, who is the top of the ADP values. Oh, he went 1 pick ahead of us. What are you thinking?
The player I was most worried about losing actually was Garendo, who I think is a potential star. And it's a little bit odd to me that he's lasting to this point. The 49ers, as they are wont to do, have been very lavish in their praise of his speed and how he fits what they want to do. It was funny as I was looking him up recently. One of his former coaches was comparing him to Jonathan Taylor. His argument for his lack of collegiate numbers is that the teams would just play different people, which, at a certain point, you'd like it to be so clear cut that never came into play. On the other hand, I mean, you can only run out there if they're calling to play to get you in. So it would have been fun to go with Mitchell and then have Guerrero in the last round. I think we probably arguably still could use either running back or receiver. I mentioned Hyatt earlier. He hasn't gone. Blake Watson, I think, is a fun last round pick.
That's fine. Jalen McMillan is or like Rondell Moore would be the only other options, but let's go Watson. That's fine. He's a good 20th round pick for sure. He's a guy that I have taken at the very end of some drafts. I think he makes clear sense ahead of Estime with Estime's current injury, although I've taken Estime as well. I think you want exposure to the Denver running backs, and those guys being really cheap are options. We did grab Devontae Walker in there as our 6th wide receiver. I'm not sure if we ever mentioned that, but he was another Baltimore bring back. So we already had Zay Flowers and Walker. Didn't really have to get into the Baltimore running back game. So the final team, Guerrero is another one. I love the call, Sean. I tried to think through a little bit why he's so cheap. Again, in this context of liking a lot of the landing spots for these rookie running backs. And I did take him the other day and was thinking I probably should take more of him. So now that you say that, I think I took him this morning to close out a draft. But now that you say that, I'm going to make sure to take some more of him. Does that mean you're out on Elijah Mitchell? I've been taking Mitchell too. And I saw a quote that said that they still kind of view Mitchell as the RB2. And so I did take him in a couple of spots as well, especially when it correlates a little bit. But what do you think? You think Guerrero is just the play ahead of him?
I think that there is a scenario in which Guerrero is so good. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about him is that, he's more of a receiving threat, which you're not necessarily thinking about because of his size, speed combination. And it's more like straight line speed than with David Johnson, where he had the just insane agility. But it's almost a little bit more that profile than the way he's often thought of. And I think that flexibility could potentially really help him. But Elijah Mitchell to me is not good enough and hasn't been good enough to earn. Nothing is going to ever be a committee with Christian McCaffrey, but certainly with some of the injuries that McCaffrey has had, both serious and nagging over the last couple of years, you'd love to be able, especially in these blowouts, to take a little bit off of his plate. I think they're hoping that Guerrero can push to do that. The other issue that I have with Mitchell, and you want to be careful about, taking something from the past, especially when they're not necessarily serious injuries, and, forecasting that out into the future. But for a backup running back, his availability has always been poor. And if you're a backup running back, the main thing that you need to be able to do is get through practice healthy. And that has been a problem for him. Guerrero to me has both more upside and just is more likely to be the guy who's there healthy, ready when they're trying to spell McCaffrey, especially if any of those sort of receiving chops do translate.
I think that's a great take. The uncertainty there, the upside element of it that you talked about. We're running into this in a lot of places in the fantasy community right now where a lot of things have gotten a lot sharper, but we get to the pattern matching stuff where it's like, well, Guerrero's just another Tyrion Davis-Price, who was just another Trey Sermon or whatever. Like this pet project, Kyle Shanahan running back that they drafted too high and then don't use. Eventually, they might use one. And the reasons that, or like the player might be good enough, right? And the reasons that they liked him and drafted him validate. And the reasons the fantasy community were so in on Sermon with 3rd round draft capital and Tyrion Davis-Price with 3rd round draft capital. Guerrero gets 4th round draft capital this year, but in a class where most of the backs went in the 4th round. That's where the big run of backs went. This is the one that the Niners liked and went and got. He might just be the exception to that recent trend. Regardless, it's just probably not good analysis to be like, well, yeah, because of past similar looking rookie running backs not working in San Francisco, then I don't want to be on this one. He's a completely different human being. And the reason that we were on those other ones was that the 49ers scheme is a very good scheme. Now, I mean, at the time, Christian McCaffrey wasn't even, at the time for some of those, Christian McCaffrey wasn't even on the roster. So it's a little bit of a different thing at this point. But Guerrero, to your point, having this upside scenario where he's just better than Elijah Mitchell, the uncertainty of rookies, like that's something to always keep in mind. Blake
the
Watson,
other part too there, Ben, is why would you pattern match just to running back with them? Because, why couldn't he be their running back version of Brock Purdy? Why couldn't he be their running back version of Deebo Samuel? Why couldn't he be their running back version of George Kittle? All of those guys, in one way, shape, or form, were drafted. Well, with Kittle and Purdy, you get late-ish picks. And then with Deebo, you get a pick where you could look at some of the analytics and be like, well, I mean, this is the 49ers being the 49ers. It's like, yeah, I mean, you got the greatest run after the catch wide receiver that the league has more or less ever seen. I'm sure there are some other guys I'm not thinking of, but you go and look at his numbers. Obviously, they're insane. You hit on all three of those guys, but you're going to be out on the running back position with a guy with Guerendo's athleticism. I mean, that's, again, as you mentioned, probably not good analysis.
That's a great point too. Yeah, they have found sort of underrated traits and then found superstars in key spots. Sort of the money ball of, identifying something that's been a little bit overlooked. Shawn, let's look at this final roster here in our Superflex build. We ended up hitting on a lot of running backs in the later part. What was the final build there, if you don't mind scrolling up? It was a 3-8-7-2. So we talked about this. You only have to start 2 receivers in 1 flex, 2 running backs in 1 flex. We wind up hitting a lot of later round running backs, in part because we took the early wide receiver capital on the high-end wide receivers, so you don't need as much redundancy late, and there's not good receivers late anyway. The team is CJ Stroud, Geno Smith, and Justin Fields at quarterback. At running back, it's Bijan Robinson, and then a huge Grand Canyon-sized golf until we draft again. Chase Brown, Kendre Miller, Jalen Wright, Kamani Vidal, Will Shipley, Isaac Guerrero, Blake Watson. We finished with 5 straight rookies. Kendre Miller might as well be a rookie. That's 6 of our 8 running backs are basically unproven. At wide receiver, Nico Collins, Jaylen Waddle, Zay Flower, Xavier Worthy, Tyler Lockett, Wan'Dale Robinson, Devontae Walker. At tight end, we have Kyle Pitts and Brock Bowers. We stick to the 2 tight ends. We have some buy issues. Shawn, this was a draft also where, I mean, the whole sniping thing is what it is. But in terms of trying to correlate and build out thoughtfully, and then what was there for us from a value perspective, or could have been there, could have fallen to us in some various spots, it didn't really land the way that we would have scripted it. And so there is some, I think one of the fun things about Superflex is the way you really can correlate a huge chunk of your roster to some, and then like you were mentioning some of the buy issues and stuff. To some degree, we were just like, we need to just take talent at this spot because the picks that fit together nicely aren't there. And we've talked about the idea of using that stuff, buys and correlation, as more of a tiebreaker. Most of our picks were sort of like, this has just got to be the pick because there's not a tie to be broken. It's the only player kind of left that makes sense here. Not most of the picks, but a decent chunk of them, frankly. And yet I think it comes out nicely. You could have done things a little bit differently in some spots. I think, at the end, we added a lot of interesting running backs. I mentioned like the Shipley pick as one that, I think it's fine, but I'm just not like super into. I think the quarterback position, maybe with the benefit of hindsight, maybe we should have just been like hammering it early to get ahead of the run. But it's a good team, and I think it's always important to draft the best team with the room that you're in, with what you have available to you. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I guess I'm more optimistic or enthusiastic about the way that we were able to stack this up in terms of what's most important. And I think that if you have a star QB that you want to make sure that you've built around that appropriately. And we have that with the Nico Collins pick. And then off of that, we also have Zay Flowers and Devontae Walker. So that part of it, I really like. Being able to get Tyler Lockett at 5 picks below ADP in a situation where you could argue that area still does matter a little bit, to get him to go with Geno Smith, that part again, I really like. So that element of it, and even getting some of the other Houston selections as we work through there, where we have the Kansas City game in week 16, and we have some Miami players, Jaylen Waddle and Jalen Wright there for week 15. I love that portion of it. Anytime that you get Justin Fields, I mean, that's more or less just an empty-ish type of play. I don't have any issues there. And overall, I like the structure. We were able to get the 2 elite tight ends. For me, that's not as much of an emphasis in this format, but when they come together nicely, I love it. I think that the values we got at receiver, and I wanted to stay on Devontae Walker, who again is kind of that correlation play, but he's already getting Ben some steal of the draft buzz. So
fantastic.
I don't want us to say that I'm mentioning that because I'm very biased, but I'm very biased. So don't believe me on anything.
That's the guy that Sean wrote the long profile about in the preseason. If you have not read that, make sure you're subscribed to RotoViz. Go read it. Why he is so high on him as an underrated profile overall. But anytime Sean's writing about a player like that, you want to have exposure to it. Sean, I forgot about the week 15 and 16 stuff. I was thinking about the JSN pick where we did get sniped 1 pick away from our preferred way of putting the Seattle stack, but I do like the Lockett thing. We didn't get a Bears bring back. One of the fun things about these Superflex drafts, I mean, we have Houston stacked up nicely as you detailed, but now we have just a single stack on our second QB, and I completely agree. You don't really have to do major stuff with Fields. We have a bring back with the KC stuff on Fields, so that's actually kind of nice. You don't have to do a ton of stuff on the Pittsburgh side, I don't think. But one of the nice things about the Superflex drafts is if you do get to 3 like pretty clear starters, or potentially even 4, that you can stack and bring back multiple games kind of throughout, and it's a nice texture that it builds. We don't have that because we don't really have as much quarterback with Fields not being a drop back passer. We basically only have the Texans to stack up. So in some ways it needs to be Stroud being huge for all 3 of those weeks, which is fine. I'm okay making that bet. We took him in the first round, but I do like in the Superflex drafts how you can build so much correlation into it that it can be multiple things across the 3 weeks. But yeah, I mean, it's not, I mean, like even the little stuff, we got the Kendre Miller, Brock Bowers. That's one of the low key best things you can do in every draft. Week 17, New Orleans Raiders game, and 2 players that are just mispriced by a lot.
And that kind of very final-ish pick with Blake Watson, probably that amounts to absolutely nothing, but I do want to mention that he's also maybe the most exciting way of any of the Broncos backs of playing your thesis of how many passes there will be to the running back position. Right. If he can make the team, then the upside there, I think, over Jaleel McLaughlin is pretty exciting. So, Ben, that'll do it for a really fun episode of Stealing Bananas. I am Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch. I mentioned some of the fantastic work that he's been doing at Stealing Signals, but also keep in mind that he has his Stealing Signals YouTube up as well. As you're listening to this, please go over and subscribe there. Stealing Lines, the other project that he is involved in. We would love to have you over at RotoViz, coupon code RVRadio2024 at checkout for a 10% discount on your 1-year subscription. If you have more questions about Superflex, this week's shows on Overtime are Colin Kelly and I drafting in the FFPC version of the contest. I hope you enjoy that as well. Leave us a rating and review. Those help us a lot. Until next time, we love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.